One of the most peculiar developments, in my estimation, among religious people, particularly members of the Lord's church, is their aversion to studying the Old Testament to learn lessons for us today. The New Testament even shows us that the book that our Lord utilized, the book that the New Testament Christians used consistently, was the Old Testament Scriptures, to learn life lessons for us today. Actually, Paul even tells Timothy this, that from a child or a babe, you have known the sacred writings which are able to make thee wise unto salvation. 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15. And the scriptures of which he speaks there are the Old Testament scriptures. They are able to make you wise unto salvation. We learn about God. We learn about ourselves. We learn about the principles that God expects us to live by. All of these in the Old Testament. And so in this series of lessons beginning this morning, we're looking at what I call life lessons from the book of Kings. And we're looking at beginning in 1 Kings and then into 2 Kings. The book of 1st and 2nd, or the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, originally in the Hebrew Bible, these were one book, one volume. It was only the book of Kings. So also with the book of Samuel. Samuel was only one book. The book of Kings was one book, and the book of Chronicles was one book. These all were divided into two books only because of the Greek translation of it, because the Greek translation was much longer as far as pages are concerned, and so they divided into two. Consequently, the book of Kings, or the books of Kings, can be understood and divided very simply and has a simple outline that's helpful, at least in my mind, to understand the whole. And that would be beginning with the accession of Solomon the king to the throne. That would be 1 Kings chapter 1. And his reign takes us to chapter 11. So 1 Kings chapter 1 to chapter 11. And the height of Israel's glory was during Solomon's reign. Solomon, of course, the son of David. But at the death of Solomon, the kingdom divided into two. And so we have from 1 Kings chapter 12 all the way through 2 Kings chapter 17, a story of a divided kingdom. There were 10 tribes in the north that appropriated the name Israel, and 2 tribes in the south that were simply called Judah. And Benjamin was also amalgamated into Judah. I'm reading a story, for example, and one of the areas that I like to read is Western history, and I'm reading a book called Crazy Horse and Custer. And Crazy Horse and Custer simply tells the life story of 2 American warriors. Crazy Horse, a Sioux warrior born in about 1839 or 1841. Custer born 2 years prior to that. But here's what Stephen Ambrose, the author of the book, does. He takes 2 chapters on Custer, then he goes over here 2 chapters on Crazy Horse, then he comes back to 2 chapters, and he brings them closer and closer till we come to the Little Bighorn where they're together. That's exactly the way that Kings is outlined, or the way that the writer of Kings approaches the history. Both of the kingdoms at this point, beginning in 1 Kings chapter 12 through 2 Kings 17, these stories are told in parallel form. So we have the northern kingdom told maybe a chapter or 2, maybe even a part of a chapter. And then at the same time, then we'll turn attention. He says, now let's look at the south. And so we're looking at both sides. And very seldom do we find interchange between them. Sometimes we do. And that's the way that Kings is set up. When we come to 2 Kings 17, there is a dividing line. And the dividing line is 722 BC, the northern kingdom, which was the capital in Samaria, collapsed completely. And now it was gone to captivity to the Assyrians. So it was no more. It was simply obliterated and never again to rise. The only kingdom that was left, that remained, was the southern kingdom of Judah, just a small little fiefdom that was in the south. And we have just 150 years, and it collapsed as well, and the Babylonians took it in 586. So the outline of Kings is very simple. We have chapters 1 through 11, Solomon's reign. Chapter 12 through 2 Kings 17, the divided kingdom, and then finally, the kingdom of Judah, 2 Kings 18 through 25, and then the story is done. And here's something else very interesting about the way Kings is set up. In most of the books of the Old Testament, the writer of the books comes to what we might call simply a stop. And by that I mean they simply stop the episode. Here's what stops. And it leaves us like, all right, what's the rest of the story? And it wants you to turn the page, go to the next book, right? So it just comes to a stop. Well, what happens next? Well, you'll have to go to the next book to discover it. But Kings is a little bit different. Kings comes to a complete and final conclusion. This is it. That was the finale. They're all in captivity. And it concludes the entirety. And you can see that when you turn in your Bibles. I hope your Bible's open right now. If you look in your Bibles, if you turn from 2 Kings 25 and you turn over one page, you go into Chronicles. And the Chronicles account, you go back to Adam. He's going to tell the story all over again. He starts with Adam, and he brings down the family tree, all of the lineage, and he brings it down, particularly to the days of David, and then recounts some of the things that took place in David's line and then the divided kingdom as well. So it starts all over again. So the point being simply that 2 Kings, when it finishes, that's it. That's the end of the story. That's what happened. So the important thing for us are the lessons that we learn from the book of Kings. And what are those lessons? We might summarize them. This is my own summation of it. We learn a lot about, number one, the nature of man, how man behaves, and what really motivates me, what motivates you, what motivates individuals. We learn a lot about man. We learn much about government, what happens in government when this occurs. You know, our founding fathers loved to go back to the book of Kings or to the Old Testament generally and discover what occurs in a government when we do this. And here's what they discovered is going to happen. And that's exactly what we discover. Or we learn about, not only that, but we learn about religion. We discover about religion. Not only discover about ourselves, man, we discover about the government, we discover about religion. And in that religion, we discover what happens when certain things are added. And then we also learn a lot about God himself, because the entire Bible is really an expression of God speaking to you, and he is expressing his personality, and he's showing you who God is. That's what the Bible entirely does. Let's pick up just one of those for just a moment, and that would be the expression of religion, how the Old Testament in the book of Kings shows us about religion, and it has everything to do with us today. We learn, for example, in Kings that people apostatized, and they did so readily. And they did so in a number of ways. They might have apostatized simply by allowing, for example, we'll see this small little epitaph written regarding a king. It will say that he was a good king, however, the high places remained. Now, what are the high places? Well, those were unauthorized places of worship. God said, you're going to worship in Jerusalem where I put my name, and the unauthorized places of worship, they put them in high places on hills. And so a king might be a good king. He did what was right, but there was a weakness in the man. He allowed the high places to remain. He allowed unauthorized worship to continue. Then you'll have apostasy in this regard, and that led to apostasy. You can see how that would lead to apostasy. Then you'll have other statements made, such as, here is particularly, of course, the one most notable, and that is Jeroboam, he who made Israel to sin. Now, that statement is made 13 times after Jeroboam's day. He was a king in the north, the first king of the northern kingdom in the divided period. What happened? Well, he introduced innovation. He didn't simply allow those things to occur. He actually introduced innovation. I don't want you going down to Judah to worship. I want you to worship here at Dan and Bethel, and I want you to do it in this way. And so he introduced different innovative ideas of his own making and put them in there, but he wanted to worship God by means of his own method. Doesn't that say a lot about what's going on right now in religion? People want to worship God as they want to worship, and they want to innovate as they want to innovate. And they do what they want to do, and they say, well, we're worshiping God. That's what Jeroboam did. So he actually was asserting himself and injecting innovations. That's a little different than simply allowing high places to exist. And then you will find the final apostate movement, and that is where people simply abandon God, and they do it right here in Jerusalem, in the temple. Horrible as it is, but they begin to worship idols. And all that came in its train, such as homosexuality. They had homosexuals that actually worked in the temple and worked as prostitutes for these idol worshipers. Catamites, sodomites. They had astrology. They had different idols given to different gods. And this, of course, is a complete and total repudiation and rebellion against the one God of the Bible. But that's the way that the departures in religion work. And you can see it in stages as it goes along in the book of Kings. And so that's always important for us to think about. But here's something else I want you to keep in mind, and that is that the King's writer wants you to understand that these things are true. Not simply true in the historical sense. They are that. He wants you to understand these things are true. That is, this is what we did, and this is what happened. This is how we apostatized, and this is what occurred. That's exactly what he's saying. He's wanting you to do that, understand that. But he's doing more than that. He's actually inviting you into the picture. And that is to say, it's true in that sense, historical sense, but it's also true for all people everywhere. It is true for you too. If you do this, this is what will occur. If you do this, this is what the result will be. And that's exactly what the King's writer's doing the entire time. I want you, he says, to come into the story, and I want you to understand that when you do this, this is what's going to happen to you. Someone asked me, and I get in these discussions, as you can imagine, so frequently about the political scene and at school, and I have friends that some of them are very, very conservative, some are not so, but one guy who's a real conservative guy, he says, you know, Mr. Lockwood, he says, what's going to happen in America? What do you think is going to happen here? I said, well, it's already written. He said, what do you mean? I says, here it is. Just read it. Read it. Here it is. It's already there. There is no question about it. The King's writer is inviting you to understand this is what happens when you do this. And there's no alternative. There's no other option. And that's exactly what the King's writer is doing. And so no matter how many Josiahs might come along and give reformation, and he did give a reformation, that would be in 2 Kings 18 and 19. He gave a reformation, too little, too late. And that's the way it goes. Now, that may be a sober and very somber view of history, but that's the way God lays it out. And he wants you to understand this will happen to you too. So thinking about that, as we're thinking about kings as a whole, he has what is called, what we might call, a messianic view of history. A messianic view of history, because it simply fits into the timeline, bringing you to the Messiah. So how does that work? So we begin this with 2 Samuel, chapter 7, verses 12 through 16. So I want you to look at 2 Samuel 7. I'm not making a mistake there. It's 2 Samuel 7, verses 12 through 16. And the promise is given to David along these lines. Here's the statement that is made to David. Now remember, Nathan the prophet had spoken these words to David, and he made this glorious, fabulous promise. When your days are fulfilled, and you shall sleep with your fathers, I will set up thy seed after thee that shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will, now listen to the words here. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. If he commits sin, I will chasten him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the children of men. But my loving kindness will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be sure, and your throne shall be established forever. There is a great promise, and we call it the Davidic Promise, 2 Samuel 7, 12 through 16. It's a Davidic promise. That is, he would never have a failure of one to sit upon his throne. Now, what has that to do with the kings? Well, the King's writer calls your attention to that promise over and over and over again. So, turning to the book of 1 Kings, for example, when David is dying. Now, the book of Kings opened as David is on his deathbed. Solomon's going to take the reins of government, and David speaks to Solomon, and he says, I want you to remember, and he mentions in chapter 2 now, verse 4, here's the promise that God gave me, that if you are faithful to God, he will establish you on the throne as he promised me. This is the promise to which he refers. The same thing when you come to chapter 6 and verse 12. Once again, the King's writer refers back to that promise. He's showing you this is a crimson thread that runs right through the book of Kings. Chapter 6 and verse 12. This is God speaking to Solomon. And God tells Solomon, if you're going to be faithful, if you do this, as I promised David your father, one will always sit on the throne. Same thing in chapter 8, verse 25. This is now in Solomon's dedicatory prayer to God. Now remember, Solomon built the one of the greatest wonders of the world, the temple. And it occupies, it's kind of interesting here, the King's writer just stops. He goes through it, he tells you how it was built. We think, well, that's kind of hard to read. That's kind of historical, it's archaeological, it's architectural reading. But he wants you to really feel the glory of the temple. And at the end of the building of the temple, which takes us from chapter 5 through chapter 8, God tells Solomon, this is the second time he appears to Solomon, he says, I want you to know, if you are faithful, I will always have a man to sit on the throne, as I promised to David your father. And he's talking about that promise in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And then when Solomon finally fails, and the bright sunshine of Solomon's reign now is simply a sunset, as Solomon dies and the kingdom is divided, then you have the statement made again in chapter 11, verses 9 through 10, 1 Kings 11, in which, when the kingdom divides, the speaker here is Ahijah of Shiloh, and he's telling us that the promise that was given to David is going to maintain itself, but God says, I'm going to split the kingdom up. Now, this division is of me. I'm going to tear it up, but I will leave one tribe. Remember, Benjamin was now with Judah. I'll leave one tribe, only one, for David's sake, to whom I promised, I will always set one upon the throne. And he refers back to that promise of 2 Samuel 7, 12 through 16. And he does this over and over again. And he wants you to know that there's this crimson line that runs right through, all the way through the book of Kings. And that's the Messianic view. But it leaves you asking this question. Who can possibly fill the role that was given to David? The promise that was given to David. Who could possibly fill the role as was worded in the promise that Nathan spoke to David? Who can do it? Can Solomon do it? No, the answer is no. The King's writer wants you to draw the conclusion, no, Solomon can't fulfill it. He doesn't fulfill it. Even though the promise was mentioned a number of times, he's only a type of someone who would come later. Therefore, when we come to 2 Kings, chapters 18 through 25, the last portion of it, and you'll not see his name here, but the last portion, just for reference sake, there's a prophet, and he's a writing prophet. That is, there are many prophets that did not write. Some of them wrote. And this man wrote the longest book in the Old Testament, and that would be Isaiah. Isaiah during Hezekiah's reign. And Isaiah says in chapter 55 and verse 3, Isaiah 55 and verse 3, I will make an everlasting covenant with you. This is future. Even the sure mercies of David, that is, the steadfast promise that I gave to David, I'm going to make it. It will be an everlasting covenant. And that is still future when Isaiah writes, almost at the very end of the book of Kings, the end of Old Testament history as far as the kingdom of Israel is concerned, except for, of course, after coming back from captivity. So the question is, who is the one to fulfill this? We have to turn to the New Testament to see how all of this ties together. Now, this is Paul doing the speaking, and the chapter is 13 of Acts, and the verse is 34. You might just look at it, Acts 13, and the verse is 34. Paul is preaching in Antioch of Pisidia. And in his sermon, I want you to listen what Paul has to say pertaining to that promise given to David. As concerning that he raised him from the dead, now no more to see corruption, he has spoken on this wise, I will give you the holy and sure blessings of David. And he quotes Isaiah 55 and 3, which references 2 Samuel chapter 7. In other words, it is only in Christ that the fulfillment of the promise is found. Same thing in the Hebrew writer, chapter 1 and verse 5, he tells us, I will be to him a father, he shall be to me a son. And he applies it to Jesus Christ. You recognize the terminology? 2 Samuel chapter 7. The book of Kings, therefore, simply fits into that entire episode and the entire story and brings us to the Messiah. And the King's writer wants you to know that it can't be fulfilled by anyone on the earth. It has to be fulfilled by someone else, and that, of course, is the Messiah. So that's what Kings is all about. And it ties right into the entire story of the Bible. So let's think about this. The King shows us, the book of Kings shows us the reality is there are two thrones, what I call simply two thrones. There is the throne of man, which is a failing government of man on the earth. And there is number two, the throne of God in heaven, the unfailing government of God in heaven. And there's always two thrones. So let's look first of all at the failing government of man. And the story is, and the lesson is simple. The man cannot govern himself. Man is not able to govern himself. We'll see a little bit about why that is the case. And so we have the failing government of man because we have, for example, Solomon's kingdom began in the height of its glory, such as the midday sun, but the sun set very, very quickly in Solomon's end of his life, didn't it? And it was it was dark. And then when you come to the end of 2 Kings, it's all blackness, it's all dark. That's what happens when men try to govern themselves and leaving God out of the equation. It's exactly how it goes. And so we meet Solomon. Solomon is known for his material magnificence, his great wisdom. But he was a man who failed also miserably because he went the way of all the earth, spiritually speaking. And he ended in failure. And that's the way it ends in 1 Kings chapter 11. Then we meet his son. Here's an example. We meet Rehoboam. We meet a man who is a true autocrat. An autocrat. Now, you might be familiar with some of those, such as we see in Washington, D.C. right now. An autocrat. They don't care what you say. We're going to do it our way, period. He said this, when the advisors came to Rehoboam, son of Solomon, said, look, the people are tired of the taxes. They're about to rebel because of the high tax rate that you have here. And they said, by the way, there's a great big train of truckers that are driving right up to Jerusalem, and they're telling us no more mandates. And he says, you know what? My little finger is stronger than my father's loins. That is bigger than his leg. I'll take care of them. And boy, that attitude, it doesn't matter what might be in the offing, what might be about to occur. They just have this attitude, stick their jaw out, say, I'll take care of this, and within a few verses, just a few years, his great kingdom crumbled into just a small little fiefdom, no bigger than the size of Rhode Island. And that's what he had. That's what happened. It divided, split right in the middle. They seceded. They seceded. Texas seceded from Judah. That's what happened. All right, so the northern kingdom split, and that's but what you have is an autocrat. That's Rehoboam. Then you have a man, Jeroboam. He's all about accommodation. Jeroboam says, you know, I'm in the north here. I don't want you traveling down to Jerusalem to worship. So because you might want to become Judahites again. You might want to go back. You might want to cement back together with the southern kingdom. So I don't want you going down there. Matter of fact, I'm going to shut down your Facebook accounts and all that, and you're not going to even talk to the people down there. And you're not going to have anything to do with them, no emailing, nothing like that, and we're going to manage the news here. That's his attitude. But he says, what we're going to do is we're going to play things of worship, idols of worship here in Dan and Bethel, and you come here to worship. So he introduced false worship, and he was accommodating to the people, and he wanted to worship the one true God, but he said, here's how we're going to do it. And he introduced innovations into worship. And he is forever known, 13 times mentioned, Jeroboam, he who made Israel to sin. We're going to meet Asa, a great king. He was a good man. He was the king in the south, one of the kings in the south. You know, there were no good kings in the north. None of them had the final write-up of their name saying, he's a good guy. None of them. There were several in the south. Asa was one of them. But Asa was weak. He was weak, and he had a prophet come to him. His name was Azariah. Azariah says, man up, my friend. What are you doing? Gird on your loins. Let's be a man. Stop doing this. Stop compromising. Stop being so weak. What happens? What does that teach us about leadership? They're collapsing because of the political pressure. So even though Asa was good, he allowed the high places to remain. You meet Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat was a compromiser also. He was a king in the south. Ahab, you know his name from infamy. Ahab asked him to go to war over to a city called Ramoth Gilead, and he said, Jehoshaphat said, I'll go, and my army becomes your army, and my horses are your horses, and whatever you want to do, Ahab. The prophet Micaiah came out and said, no, this is wrong. And Jehoshaphat continued to compromise. So the key word of Jehoshaphat is compromise, not simply weak. He compromised. And he compromised over and over again. Why do they do that? Why do men do that? Why do people, leaders in the church, compromise? Why do we do that? Weakness. That's what happens. And so we have the failing government of man. But at the same time, we have the unfailing government of God. God's behind the scenes, and he is orchestrating events. So he appears to Solomon twice, tells him in chapter 3, also in chapter 9 of 1 Kings, if you are faithful, they'll not fail a man to sit upon the throne of David. If you are faithful. He tells him that 2 times, and he appears to him twice. Then also, finally, when Solomon does not fulfill the promise and is a failure, then we have Ahijah, the prophet from Shiloh, come in. And he says, you know, God's going to tear the kingdom up, and when the kingdom tears, this is of God. God's behind the scenes. He's doing it. God's throne is still operating. God's governing the world. Shemaiah is another great prophet. He comes to Rehoboam. Rehoboam said, no, you don't. No, we're not going to let the northern kingdom secede. We're not going to let Texas secede up there. What we're going to do is we're going to go to war with them, and we're going to stop them. Shemaiah is a man of God. He comes in and says, no, you're not. I'm speaking for God. I'm an inspired prophet, and God is not with you. This is of God. Now, you know that took a lot of backbone, didn't it? Because you don't know what Rehoboam's going to do. He's the man who just got done saying, you know, my little finger's stronger than my daddy's loins. I'll do what I want to do. Don't cross me. Don't brook my opinion. And he just came in and told him, no. But you meet Shemaiah. What a great man of God. And you're going to meet those kind of individuals continually because we have God governing. Consequently, since God is the one who's governing, the heroes of the story of Kings are the prophets. They're the prophets. You take all the prophets out, take all of the spokesmen of God away, and you don't have much of a story. You have just a dismal, sad episode. Here's something to keep in mind. Every one of the prophets had a pulpit. And you know the people did not like one of them, not one. They were not popularly acclaimed anywhere. The popular churches shunned them, every single one of them. We can talk about Nathan, who's a great prophet. Actually, he was probably the only exception to that. He was an advisor to King David at David's death. But then after that, we have prophets such as Ahijah of Shiloh. Ahijah the prophet. We have Shemaiah, one we just mentioned. We have a nameless prophet of God. Now, this is interesting. I was talking with Nita about the lesson the other day. She said, now, why does he remain nameless? We don't even know his name. I said, I don't know, but here's my understanding, my thought on it. We don't know the man's name. Because in the grand scheme of things, it makes no difference, does it? What makes a difference is whether we are faithful to God. And we need to get that message. And the man of God in chapter 13 of 1 Kings came to Jeroboam and predicted the demise of his alternate places of worship. We're not told his name, but then he disobeys God himself. So we have an entire chapter that shows us about the nameless man of God. And then who can forget the great man Elijah, who comes before Ahab, and Ahab says, you are my enemy. That's how he considered it to be. Or how about Micaiah? Micaiah, in the very end of 1 Kings chapter 22, Micaiah is a great man of God. We don't know anything about him prior to, but when Ahab speaks about him, you think, boy, I appreciate that guy. He's my hero. Ahab says, you know what? He's in jail, and I don't want him coming out and talking about my predicted or my ideas of going to Ramoth-Gilead and my predicted battle. I don't want him talking about it because he is my enemy, and he always tells evil things regarding me. I thought, there's a guy. They finally brought him out, Micaiah. And boy, he mocked Ahab right there. And here's an interesting thing, too. Do you know Ahab had a church already there? He had 450 people right there in the church. It was the biggest congregation in town. 450, they're all inspired by the leaders of the prophets, and they were running around and they were saying, you go up to Ramoth Gilead, Ahab, and you're going to be victorious. And one guy walks in, his name is Micaiah, says, no, it will not be, you'll not come back alive. Now that is so unpopular. Fall in line, Micaiah. And that's exactly what Jehoshaphat said. Why don't you let your word be like one of these others? Why don't you let your word be like theirs? You see the pressure put upon people of God? Just be like the rest of the religious people. And this was the biggest church in town. So we meet all of these great sterling characters. But in the end, that which only mattered is God's view of history. Because when it comes down to it, when you see the epitaphs of these kings, it will tell you simply this: he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. Or he did that which was sinful, and he followed in the ways of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. Or he did good, but he did not take away the high places. He was too weak. It didn't matter what kind of military prowess a king might possess. It didn't matter what kind of political machination he might be able to pull off. It didn't matter what kind of power he might have around the world, or what kind of riches or materialistic wealth, or whatever other people thought about him, or what the family was all about. What did matter was one thing: whether he was faithful to God, yes or no. That's the bottom line. That's it. It mattered not what house he lived in. It doesn't matter what kind of palace he built. It mattered not where he traveled. It didn't matter anything about that, but just did he do what God said to do. That's all. That's God's view of history. And your epitaph is going to read one way or the other also. And it doesn't matter what we write on the stone, it's what God writes. Isn't that right? It's what God writes. And that's what matters. And that's what Kings is all about, showing us exactly that. So because of that, the last point simply is, very briefly, and that is, this is not secular history. Many people come to the book of Kings and they say, well, this doesn't fulfill the requirements or the canons of history as it normally is written. And it doesn't. It's not like, okay, I'm going to go pick up a history book and read it. It's not like that at all. Because it's not secular history. God's not interested, and He's not interested for you to know necessarily a lot of different events that occurred, because there's only one thing that matters, as we just noted. Consequently, in Kings, we're not going to see the greatness of Jeroboam number 2. He was another Jeroboam number 2. He was a great king, and we learn that from secular history. We learn that also from looking at records that go back that are outside the Bible, but he was a great king in man's eyes. Here's something else. There was an invasion by Zerah the Ethiopian. This is in the days of Asa. Zerah the Ethiopian. We don't learn about it in Kings at all. You only find that when you go to Chronicles. God's telling you that's not the important thing here, not in this story. Or, here's something else. There was a king by the name of Manasseh, who was toward the end of the line in Judah. Manasseh actually was taken to Assyrian captivity, reformed, and was sent back home and came home and tried to reform the people, but it was too late, too little too late. You don't learn that at all in Kings. You only learn that in Chronicles. You read about Manasseh, he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, period. That's it. You don't read about those things. Or here's another one. Shaishak invaded Jerusalem in 1 Kings 14, and it's only given just a couple of verses. Shaishak was an Egyptian monarch, and he came marching in and sacked Jerusalem. And if you're writing secular history, you're like, okay, how did this happen? And you like to read all about it. But no, it's just given a short shrift right there. Boom. Or there are other ones too that, for example, you come to the end of the story, and you'll find out that there are a lot of things that are left out of the picture, such as, here's another one, Ahab. Ahab fought a battle that was at Karkar. It's now spelled two different ways, K-A-R, one word, Karkar, or sometimes it's Q-A-R. And that was north of Israel, and it was a monumental battle. Secular historians, archaeologists are all over it. They're talking about the Battle of Karkar. And Ahab went up there to fight it because he was fighting the Assyrians. They were exercising dominance, and he went up to fight it. Do you know the book of Kings nor the book of Chronicles mention it at all? Why? It's not important. It's not important. So there are many things that are left out. And instead, we're going to have this monotonous moral assessment. He did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. It becomes monotonous. Evil in the sight of the Lord. So what does all this mean? Let's boil it down. What does it mean for us? It means this primary truth, and that is, man cannot govern himself because man does not know himself. Man cannot govern himself because man does not know himself. On an individual basis, the easiest person to fool is you. The easiest person to fool is you. And we fool ourselves all the time about our motives, about what we're really about. How do we learn about ourselves? It's right here. It's right here. Man's not able to govern himself because man doesn't know himself. Only God knows you. And only with God's Word can you know about you. And you see this continually in our culture today. We can't put our finger, seemingly, on any cause of any crime or any problem in America at all. Why? We've not taken God into account. What does God say? The same thing is true regarding government. Government. Man cannot govern himself because man does not know himself. Any government that leaves God out of the equation is doomed to fail, including America. It makes no difference whether I'm talking about my home country, my hometown, or not. That's the truth of God's Word. You leave God out of the equation, and that's it. And there is no alternative. Only God knows how to help us govern. We cannot leave God out of governing principles in our country. And our founding fathers knew that. They went back continually to the Old Testament to make the discoveries of how to make government work. And what makes it work, and what are the things that causes it to gum up. And we'll find out. Find all that out right here in the book of Kings. Furthermore, man's not able to govern himself regarding religion. Regarding religion, how so? Well, because we think, I like this, I like that. Here's what I prefer in religion. No, man is not able to govern himself or to guide his own steps in worship. And instead, for example, Josiah, he introduced one of the greatest reforms that we will ever see in Old Testament history. The people of Judah, southern kingdom, had departed grossly. He brought, toward the end of, and this is 2 Kings now, 18 through 20. He brought great reforms, but what happened? It didn't get to the heart. It didn't change the internals. They simply changed the forms, the outward form, and they were just going through the motions, and it was a shell of worship. And men do not know how to guide themselves. They have to go by what God has to say pertaining to worship as well. So the bottom line is what? For us and me personally, trust in the Lord with all your might, lean upon His understanding. In all of your ways, acknowledge God, and He will direct your paths. That's what the book of Kings is all about. The lesson is yours if you want to respond to the invitation. We stand and sing this only to encourage you. If you want to respond, we'll pray with you, for you. While we stand and sing, come to the front if you will.